Why don't we take just a teeny little bit off of the placement and make a damn good ad?
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. This episode is all about how campaigns can create media for their ad campaigns on a low budget. Despite an increase in political spending, especially when it comes to media, the need for campaigns to create content is growing every day. So campaigns of all sizes now need to think about how they balance output and costs. Our focus today is going to be on video creative since it's the most in demand and frequently the most expensive. To help us understand and to dig into this topic and more, we're joined by Danny Laub, partner at Poolhouse, who serves as a key political advisor and media consultant for Republican campaigns across the country. We talked with Will Ritter, another partner and co-founder of Poolhouse, in an earlier episode of the Business of Politics show, which will be linked in the show notes if you want to go back and listen to that. Danny, instead of starting this conversation in the obvious way about what we can do to save costs in media, I want to go to the other side of the coin. In your mind, what corners absolutely should not be cut, no matter what, in developing campaign creative?
Well, I think ultimately, Eric, there's a few key components. I'd start with hair and makeup and audio. I think those places where you cut corners in the wrong ways and it doesn't work in any way that makes sense. Those are kind of like the technical side of it.
Yeah.
But a key component too that I think is often overlooked when you're thinking about what you're trying to cut is that a lot of what we do on the ad making side and the creative strategy side is based off of ideas and written words and concepts and messaging, which they equal time, not necessarily a monetary thing you can cut. So allowing the time to get it right is super important, and dedicating that time, I think, is crucial to the success.
So I want to dig into more of the hair and makeup and the audio, but
yeah,
I think if I could summarize it, it's the storytelling and having something compelling to say or worthwhile to say that you cannot overlook in creating ads or media for campaigns.
Yeah, I think in a crowded media landscape that we live in now, we're seeing a lot of the same type of cookie cutter ads over and over and over, cycle after cycle. It's a scenario where those ads, the message is bad and the quality is bad, and it's all just doesn't break through. And ultimately, you can have the most creative ad on any budget, and if the message sucks, it's not going to penetrate.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the hair and makeup and audio. How would not having good hair and makeup manifest itself in a negative way?
Ultimately, whether you're putting an ad on digital or whether you're taking photos for stills or banner ads, or whether you're making a 6 second, a 15, a 30 or 60 or an intro video that's longer for a candidate or a cause, you're selling a product, and your product is your candidate. And ultimately, putting them in the best light possible to be taken the most seriously is important. And a little hair and makeup goes a long way in making that polished image happen and making sure people can connect with you. Because ultimately, if it's off-putting imagery, they're probably not going to listen to what you have to say anyway.
There is this phenomenon of, we're not just competing against other campaigns or candidates.
Yes.
When we're creating these, we're competing against all the other content that people consume. So think about that influencer who all they have to do all day is create YouTube videos. And so, they may even be creating content around hair and makeup. So you're competing with that, the level of sort of amateur content, not just the high definition stuff that you're seeing, on TV or network news. And so it is important that it at least rises to a bar of credibility or passes the smell test to someone who sees what real hair and makeup looks like every day.
Well, and also, Eric, I mean, you just think about it when you're watching Wheel of Fortune or Jeopardy or the local news.
How old do you think I am?
All right, fair point.
All right, in a hypothetical world.
Hypothetical, if you were watching these amazing game shows, I would say, like, you're going to see a local car commercial that's probably produced really poorly. You're going to see a political ad or two, and then you're going to see an Oreo commercial, right? And those production values, and oftentimes you are going to be viewing those with the sound off anyway. Right. So all you have is the text, or all you have is the visual. So you're honestly, if you're not investing the resources, albeit limited occasionally, into that image and that text and what that looks like with the audio off, you're losing a portion of your message anyway.
Yeah, and that's a really important point that we don't consider. I mean, you and I have been on these campaigns where we argue about every single second of a video and what it shows and what it does, and you lose the forest for the trees of where it's going to appear. Right? This is no one else is going to study it as closely as we are. That's obviously very important. And then, so in the case that someone does leave their volume on, we want that audio to be clear and professional and crisp.
Yeah. And I think there's many ways to do it. I mean, even on the digital video side, I'm fascinated by these TikTok recorder little microphones that all these influencers are using that, are a couple $100, oftentimes under $100, but the audio is clear, and albeit it looks like you have a weird square in your clothes. So like it wouldn't
you get like a caterpillar crawling on you.
Yeah. Right. It wouldn't work in every scenario. But if you're doing a digital video, when I started on campaigns, we used to call this new media, which is still hilarious to me. Back then, the director of new media, or the new media director, or whatever you wanted to call it.
Right.
And, it was, you yelled at a DSLR from, 8 feet away about your fundraising goal. And I think those TikTok influencers, or those other, because we're in such a content generation, we've been able to adapt things. You don't always need to have a professional audio tech to have professional enough audio to accomplish our mission. And I think there's creative ways and there's budget-friendly ways to accomplish that without having to sacrifice.
So let's get kind of specific here. What's an example of a campaign ad that you've worked on that was probably on the smaller end of the budget, but had an outsized impact?
We did Governor Youngkin's media in the 2021 race. A variety of ads come to mind. We did one about the governor's now grocery tax repeal, right, and it's called Common Sense, CENTS, because we like puns and funny things here. So it's called Common Sense.
Puns on things that you can't see.
Yeah, exactly. It was much more funny when we were shipping it to the TV station than it is on.
It had to be there.
But in that ad has now Governor Youngkin, at the time candidate Youngkin, walking through a grocery store, picking things up. He's at the checkout line, and he says,
"It's not your imagination. Consumer prices are going up. And to make matters worse, Virginia is only one of 13 states to tax groceries. As governor, I will eliminate Virginia's grocery tax. Career politicians will call it radical, but to me, it's just common sense. Because saving a little extra on milk and bread and all of this, it adds up. It's time to make it a little easier to live, work, and raise a family here in Virginia."
And it's a very simple ad. It's shot in a grocery store. It's only a couple of shots, and there's some, cool animations on it. But it wasn't a terribly complex ad to shoot, but the message is really powerful. It resonated with a lot of people, and we've heard a lot of feedback even since then that of all the ads we ran, it was one of the most impactful. But in terms of the production of it, we had a very small crew. We shot it in about 45 to 50 minutes. A lot of that's credit to the governor for being really great on camera. So I can't
Good at reading his cue cards. No, I'm kidding.
He probably memorized the script if I think back now on that day. But all of that to be said, it wasn't, jumping out of airplanes, and it wasn't 97 locations. It was a core message in 74 words. It was a really stark visual of a grocery store that puts you in a setting, and it was a one singular message. And it was able to penetrate in such an obvious way. And so many people would just watch that ad and be like, duh, this is so obvious. He is clearly speaking to the kitchen table issues that so many people in Virginia were feeling the squeeze on at the time.
Right. And it led to a bunch of copycats throughout the rest of the cycle. I mean, not only just because of the campaign that he ran and the success, but that issue was top of mind for a lot of voters. So it really was a trendsetter in that regard. And, one thing that we've noticed over the years is that really high production value, especially when it comes to graphics and edits, doesn't necessarily translate to reach via social media. So like this vertical video, the full screen on mobile devices, like we're seeing on TikTok or Instagram Reels, is really taking off. And of course, that's primarily made with your phone. What do campaigns need to know about incorporating vertical video into their media strategy?
Well, it's really interesting. The vertical video stuff, I think, is fascinating, and it reminds me of, as an ad maker and a strategist, you try to test as many things as possible all the time, as much as you can, in different platforms, because you never know what's going to pop or where it's going to go. And vertical video, I think, has totally taken off, and we've found that even when we put up an ad in a typical way on Instagram, and then we put up a similar ad for a similar client or the same client that was made for vertical video, that you obviously cut vertical, obviously has, significantly more text, has more of that like TikTok style of text popping up everywhere, or even subtitles at the bottom. We're seeing, 2 and 3 and 4 times the views, the engagement, the shares on those videos. And quite frankly, it's the same content. It's just formatted slightly differently. So on a lot of the digital video stuff, we are now starting from vertical video.
Oh, really?
There's often times where it's like, we say, okay, we're going to do this 15-second ad, and we're going to start it from the vertical video and build backwards. And there's some things you can do in terms of the way you layer creative and the way you do text on a vertical that is just a little bit different. So you have to adapt it. But it's pretty close in my mind to being the same. It just goes back to being super intentional about where the medium and where the pieces of creative are, right? You're not going to treat a 6-second ad the same way you're going to treat a 30-second ad when you're conceptualizing it, and you shouldn't do it in any other ways.
Yeah. And it just reminds me of our original point of, it is getting so much more complex to create enough media and content for these campaigns. So, we were in the early days of like, okay, we've got to get a 30-second for digital. We've got to get a 15-second for digital, a 6-second for a YouTube bumper. And that was kind of a heavy lift. And now it's, if you're not doing vertical, you're really missing out. I mean, you're just leaving views and reach on the table.
It's a similar thing though, Eric, on the vertical stuff as the 6 or the 15. It's not terribly difficult to, if you're thinking creative first, to build those assets in a full suite with, make it all look the same. We'll use the grocery tax ad as an example. Like, your static graphics should look the same as your vertical video, as your TV ad, as, the 15-second bumper that's running, as the 6-second, as the pre-roll non-skippables. It should all be in the same family. And if you're thinking of that first, rather than the old-fashioned way of, we're going to make a 30-second ad and then other digital guys can go figure out what their content is.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Danny Laub from Poolhouse about how to create media on a low budget. And so, Danny, as a professional on the creative side, where do you see the role of message testing in the process? Obviously, you've got to have a core message to build your media around, but where does testing and data fit into that equation for you?
I think that oftentimes we over test and over analyze. And when it comes to some of these things, like there's a lot of politics which is done on feel and experience and creative. And I think there's a value in the testing, and there's a value in seeing what works and watching how things perform, both digitally and otherwise. But ultimately, the number one metric that matters in politics is winning. Like, I truly don't care how you busted the impression lid off of what's previously been done if you get your butt kicked by 12 points on election day. So I think a lot of times on the testing front, it's helpful to know where it goes. But at our firm, we oftentimes know when we've built an ad that's going to do well by the feel of it, by how it plays. And we're generally pretty right. We're often not surprised too much about what ends up testing well and what ends up moving voters well. And ultimately, we look at it and say, you can test things to death. I think the role of testing matters, but we are getting into the overly testing series of politics.
I think that's right, particularly on the front end, right? Of these videos or ads where it's like, okay, I know what your top 7 issues were in the poll that you fielded because you just listed them as bullet points, and really being overly driven by, we've got to say these words even though it's awkward and not what people talk about. The thing that I think is missing, particularly with how difficult it is to reach voters with different forms of media right now, and with how much money we're spending behind this, is testing the finished product to make sure that it does what we hope it will do before we then spend $1 million promoting it. And that's one thing that I see the left doing a lot of work on, where they're doing these randomized control trials and testing things out. And I think that that's an important gut check, because I've worked on campaigns where, we followed the data, we created a story, and then the ad just didn't have the desired effect. And if we had run a simple test, it might have caught that.
Well, and it goes back to, people buy products, or people buy ideas, or people buy plans or concepts from things they trust, things they like, people they trust, people they like. And ultimately, like, you can have the best 74-word poll tested ad that shoehorns the 5 images or the 5 issues into it. And if there's no connection with the viewer, there's no engagement, there's nothing, it is just a meh ad, it doesn't matter how good that message is. So a lot of it is thinking about how you can marry up all of the things to ultimately achieve the goal, which the end goal is to win an election. Right. And oftentimes before winning an election, it's moving numbers to get there.
Yeah. So let's talk about campaigns that might be more DIY or don't have as big a media budget to be on TV. What are some strategies that you'd recommend around their media or video creation?
Well, I think it's a misnomer that you shoot an ad necessarily for TV or digital on different cameras, right? Mm-hmm. There's obviously cameras that of all kinds, and I think, but you should be shooting quality ads, and the cost of cameras have gone down drastically, to where a lot of it is making content creators out of your staff. And it's using that to, even if your campaign is not something that has a huge media budget or isn't going to go on TV or isn't going to do that, it's making sure you're pushing content out, and some content is better than no content, or imperfect content is better than no content, right? So ultimately, in my opinion, it's about, you can do a lot these days with a GoPro. You can do a lot with an iPhone. You can edit videos on an iPhone. I mean, I remember I was with a campaign not too long ago, and I was on the road with them, and their body guy looks over to me and says, "Hey, check this out," and played me a video that was honestly rivaled some of the professional on the road videos I've seen. And he literally shot and edited on his iPhone in his spare time. And the barrier of entry on this stuff is just so low. You should just be doing it.
Right. Yeah, I find that equipment can be a safety blanket for people because they're afraid to put something out there and get it criticized. They say, "Oh, well, I don't have the right camera," and so it's such a balance of you want to have good quality, good production values, but
it's like sometimes, not to bash anybody on either side of the aisle here, sometimes you see these pictures that people post on social media, or they post on their stories of these huge, elaborate political setups.
Right. Yeah.
That it's like if anyone that's ever been on a film set could tell you that 2/3 of that is all for show. It's like, how much equipment can we pull off the truck so that we can play this charade of a Hollywood, film game, instead of saying, what do we need to be successful? And ultimately, if that isn't a bunch of gear, that's okay. But they're playing this charade of Hollywood filmmaker versus, what actually serves the client well.
Yeah. So, Danny, where would you put the ratio of content versus distribution for something like a campaign launch video? And I mean by that, like, what percentage should a campaign be committing to creative, and what remains for promoting it? Because it's kind of this problem: if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it really fall?
So it used to be that intro videos were the thing on both sides of the aisle. They were on the Democrat side before the Republican side, and then they became the cool thing, and then everyone freaking did them. And
Right.
now there's no novelty in them. And a lot of times, in the last couple cycles, in this cycle, last cycle particularly, unless a candidate has a particularly compelling story, or there's a particularly important part that, you want to bounce it off of DC for fundraising, or you want to do, some kind of national targeting, or you're trying to, do a political objective, my recommendation is not to do an intro video. And I think one of the reasons is you get suckered into it. You put a lot of time, a lot of money, all these things, and everyone is just doing them. And, you'll have a race, in a crowded congressional race where 7 candidates have an intro video.
Right.
And you go to YouTube, and each of them have 32 views, or 61 views, or 19 views. And it's like, you probably spent,
what is your cost per view?
Right. Significant amount of money. So unless you have a really good story to tell, and obviously it's very subjective, or a really strong political point, I think you roll that money into your first ad. And that's my recommendation, at least of recently. You get in the intro video trap. The other thing with intro videos are, they're just all kind of the same these days. There's very few things that differentiate candidates in any real way. So I think it's an intro video trap, because candidates want to feel like they're doing something, when ultimately, you could accomplish 99% of what they accomplished
with a really good press release.
Right. That's a good point. And you and I could probably write the script for just about every intro video, in about 15 minutes. And it really has kind of become homogenized across the landscape. I am struck at how it gives people the feeling that they've done something. So this constant problem of confusing action for progress. And, we got to do a intro video, and that's how people do it. And, there's some of that's in the right place, right? Because, no one, very, very few people, I'll say, need a launch rally where you have as many people as you possibly can in one place. But, to your point, if your video is only seen by 60 people, it's like an empty room for your campaign launch.
Well, and I can't think of any person, client of ours or otherwise, on either side of the aisle where I, on election day, said, or after said, did this campaign, the launch video. It propelled strong victory. So it's a thing that I think campaigns are going to start getting away from more and more. But going back to your original question of creative versus the content versus the placement, which was your question that I kind of sidestepped.
Well, I think you said zero for the launch video.
Yeah, well
100% for media.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because, and I told this story to a lot. I worked for a super PAC a couple years ago, and they're like, you have $800,000 budget for this ad, and it was an expensive market. Super PACs are obviously their own interesting world, and they said, okay, your production budget for the ad is $5,000, and we're like, why don't we take just a teeny little bit off of the placement and make a damn good ad? And ultimately, that's highlighted what kind of I think you're getting at, which is you have this teeter-totter balancing act between you don't want to make an art project that's super expensive that you don't have much money to put behind it, and then you don't want to suck all the money into placement, and you make the quality of the ad so poor it doesn't matter that you're delivering a crap message. So I think the teeter-totter there is very important, and it's understanding both what you're trying to accomplish and the media. I mean, we tell clients all the time who call us, especially on like state house or state senate races across the country, who want to shoot an ad, and they're like, we want to shoot an ad and be on TV, and our entire campaign budget is $25,000.
Right.
It's like I could say this was a good idea, but I would not sleep well at night.
Right.
Doing that. You should go invest in whether it's a digital plan or whether it's static ads or whether
direct mail,
right? Yeah. Or other opportunities to do it. And so it's all about finding that balancing act of what does a creative need to be in the quality sense versus the placement sense, and making sure that neither are out of whack.
So speaking of those down ballot campaigns, what's a trend that we're starting to see or you expect we'll see in the presidential campaign creative, which, is just a totally different beast, that these down ballot campaigns should not copy?
Generally, my opinion on presidential campaigns is you should take no lessons from them at all on the down ballot races, because they're fake in the terms of you're comparing these campaigns that all have, for the most part, a huge amount of digital staffers. They often have traveling photographers, traveling videographers, traveling editors. They have all of these communication strategists and all of these humans who are doing the work that on a lot of, do-it-yourself campaigns don't have that.
Right.
And ultimately, you look at them and you're like, wow, they're able to produce 4, beautiful rallies a day and 3 hype videos from them every day. And it's like, yeah, but what you don't see is the army of people and the army of costs that it takes to get there, right? Ultimately, that's just a different level of politics. And I guess what my overall takeaway to tell people would be is don't let that discourage you from doing something, from creating content, from pushing things out on social media. Like, what is right for someone else is not always right for you. If your state rep budget for digital is only $6,000 for the whole campaign, make that $6,000 the most magnified, best $6,000 with the most creative and interesting content you can do. And comparing yourself to, what Nikki Haley's doing at her launch in South Carolina, or Tim Scott's, $100,000 Iowa production event, or Donald Trump's $250,000 produced event in New Hampshire, it's just like different world.
Well, my thanks to Danny for a great conversation. You can learn more about Poolhouse, and I'll link to that ad that he mentioned in the show notes as well. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You look smarter in the process, more people find out about the show. So it's a win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can also sign up for email updates on our website at businessofpoliticspodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.